At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI garbage. And what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it that way. I'm Daniel Pierce, and I'm going to be your narrator. Now, let's get into today's story. Trinik knelt before the clan leader who sat on a cushioned chair, his heart pounding in his chest after confessing that he had accepted a questionable job from the leader of the local criminals. The clan leader, who was also Trinik's grandfather, spoke only after nearly a full minute of silence. I know you are young and foolish, but no amount of youth or foolishness should have led you to follow Laxar into a weapons deal inside the territory controlled by those humans of the Marine clan. My advice is that you break your promise to Laxar and leave the city in shame until the dust settles. According to tradition, Trinik could raise his head after the clan leader spoke. The ancient customs were clear on this matter. A supplicant remained bowed until the elder had finished their counsel, and only then could they meet their superior's gaze. Trinik lifted his eyes slowly, finding his grandfather's face in the dim light of the ceremonial chamber. They looked vaguely alike, as all members of their species did. Both had the characteristic long braided hair that never lost its black color throughout their entire lives, a genetic trait that distinguished their people from many other spacefaring races. The braids hung heavy down on their backs, woven with the traditional silver threads that marked their clan affiliation. But despite these similarities, the differences between them were obvious and unmistakable. Trinik was young, strong, his body still full of the vitality of someone who had not yet seen 3 decades. The purple of his skin was vivid and vibrant. The white streaks that marked his face running from his temples down across his cheekbones to his jaw were sharp and defined, giving him the fierce appearance of a true warrior in his prime. His eyes held the fire of someone who had not yet learned to temper ambition with wisdom. His grandfather, by contrast, wore his age in subtle ways. The purple of his skin had faded a bit, and his blue eyes, though still sharp, held a subtle weariness that only came from ruling a clan through generations of turmoil. As their gazes met, Trinik spoke again. Grandfather, Trinik began, his voice steadier than he felt. I understand your concern. I know the reputation of those humans from the Marine clan. I've heard the stories, the warnings. I know they're dangerous. The clan leader's expression didn't change. He simply continued to watch, to wait. But I cannot follow your advice. Trinik continued, forcing himself to maintain eye contact even as his heart hammered against his ribs. I cannot walk away from this job, not now. Still, his grandfather said nothing. The silence stretched between them, pressing down on Trinik's shoulders, demanding that he explain himself, that he justify his defiance of direct counsel from the clan's leader. Trinik took a breath, steadying himself. Ilara will be the captain of Laxar's ship this time. She's piloting them into the meeting, putting herself directly in the line of fire if anything goes wrong. He paused, his jaw tightening. I can't leave her alone. Not now that the job is this dangerous. She has no one else to turn to. No one else who would stand with her if things go bad. For the first time since Trinik had raised his head, his grandfather's expression changed. His lips curled into something that might have been a smile if it had any warmth whatsoever. Instead, it was cold, disdainful, the expression of someone who had just confirmed a suspicion they had long held. Then they laughed, a sharp sound that held no humor at all. Of course, the clan leader said, his voice dripping with contempt. Of course, this is about that low-life female. The words hit Trinik like a knife to the heart. Heat rushed through his body, anger flooding his veins and turning his vision red at the edges. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his muscles tensing as he fought against a surge of rage threatened to overwhelm him. When he spoke, he allowed himself to raise his voice just a little, just enough to convey the depth of his feelings without crossing into outright disrespect. Unlike Laxar's crew, Ilara lost her parents when she was young, Trinik said, his voice direct. She didn't have a choice about the path she took. She didn't have a family wealth or clan connections to fall back on. She survived the only way she could. He took a step forward, his hands still clenched at his sides. She never had something looking out for her grandfather, and the village, our village, failed her. His grandfather showed no reaction to the raised voice, no indication that Trinik's words had landed with any impact at all. Instead, he simply reached out with one hand, his movements deliberately slow, and grasped the teacup that sat on the small table beside his chair. He brought it to his lips and took a long sip, his eyes never leaving Trinik's face. Moments passed before he spoke again. "You can do whatever you want," his grandfather finally said, his voice perfectly level, perfectly calm. "You're of age, and I cannot stop you from making your own choices, no matter how foolish they may be." He paused, letting those words sink in. "But my advice doesn't change, Trinik. Walk away from this. Leave the city in shame if you must, but leave with your life." He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes boring into Trinik's. "If you go through with this job, if you walk into human Marine Clan territory for a weapons deal with criminals, then I will hate to inform your parents that their son became one more stupid young male who died because of someone who was not worth it." The words were the last any of them uttered to each other. His grandfather leaned back in his chair, picked up his teacup again, and took another sip. The audience was over. The counsel had been given and rejected. There was nothing more to say. Trinik stood there for a long moment, his mind churning with anger and frustration and a deep, gnawing doubt that he refused to acknowledge. Then he bowed, lower than tradition required, and turned to leave the chamber. Behind him, his grandfather sipped his tea and said nothing more. A day had passed since that painful meeting, and Trinik found himself standing in the industrial district of the city as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The air here was thick with the smell of fuel, the ground stained with decades of oil and chemical runoff. It was the kind of place that respectable people avoided, where the clan's influence was weak and the law was whatever Laxar and his kind decided it should be. Trinik approached the little warehouse where Laxar's crew hid their old spaceship, his footsteps echoing off the corrugated metal walls of the surrounding buildings. The structure ahead of him was nondescript, just another anonymous warehouse among dozens, its exterior covered in peeling paint and rust. The perfect place to hide illegal activities. "It's Trinik!" he called out loudly as he reached the entrance, announcing his presence to make absolutely sure that no one inside would shoot him by mistake. Laxar's crew was paranoid at the best of times, and jumpy criminals with weapons were not something Trinik wanted to test. "I'm coming in!" He pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, his eyes taking a moment to adjust to the dimmer interior lighting. As his vision cleared, he looked around and found himself in a space filled with crates of various sizes, stacked haphazardly along the walls. Little creatures, their local equivalent of rats, skittered across the floor and disappeared into holes in the walls. The ship itself sat in the center of the space, a battered freighter that had clearly seen better days, its hull covered in patches and repairs. But there were no people. No Laxar, no crew members, no one at all. Trinik frowned, glancing around the empty warehouse. He had arrived earlier than the scheduled meeting time, yes, but he had expected someone to be here already. Suddenly, a sharp noise of metal hitting the floor caught his attention. He spun toward the sound, his hand instinctively moving toward the weapon he didn't yet have. A compartment beneath the ship, one he hadn't even noticed, suddenly opened. tools clattered to the ground, spilling out of the newly opened space. Then a pair of feet emerged, dangling in the air for a moment before finding purchase on the ground. The legs followed, then a torso, and finally, a whole body pulled itself out from underneath the ship. Trinik stood frozen, staring at the figure that had just emerged. She was covered head to toe in grease and oil, her clothes stained black with engine fluids. It looked like she had been swimming in the ship's engine compartment. Then he squinted, looking closer at the figure, and his breath caught in his throat. Even through all the grease and dirt, even with the dim lighting and the mess that covered almost every inch of exposed skin, he could make out the distinctive white streaks that marked the person's face. "Ilara?" he said. She looked up at him, and he saw her eyes focus on his face. Yeah, that's definitely her, though he had never seen her in such a state before. "What are you doing inside the engine?" he asked, taking a step closer but stopping short of actually approaching her. The amount of grease covering her body was almost impressive. Ilara reached over to one of the crates and grabbed a piece of cloth, probably meant for cleaning tools rather than faces, and began wiping at her skin. The cloth came away black, but it barely made a dent in the layer of grime covering her. "I'm responsible for the ship," she said, her voice calm, as if emerging from underneath a spacecraft covered in engine fluids was the most natural thing in the world. "I have to make sure everything will be working for the weapons deal tonight. Laxar doesn't care about the maintenance, and the rest of the crew wouldn't know a functional engine from a pile of scrap metal. If something goes wrong during the flight, it's on me." Trinik felt his stomach twist with discomfort. He averted his gaze, looking anywhere but at Ilara's grease-covered face. "Where's Laxar?" he asked. "Where's the rest of the crew? Why is no one else here yet?" Ilara continued wiping out her face, achieving minimal success. "They're drinking and having fun in the city," she said, and there was a flatness to her tone that suggested this was their unusual behavior. She paused, the cloth stilling in her hands. "You would know that if they considered you part of the crew." The words stung more than Trinik wanted to admit. He forced a smile, trying to play it cool, to pretend that her observation didn't hit home. "I'm new," he said, injecting a lightness into his voice that he didn't feel. "I don't know him that well yet, and—" "You don't belong here." Ilara cut him off, her voice sharp and direct. She dropped the cloth and turned to face him fully, her eyes hard. "Laxar only accepted you because he needed someone who could verify when the payment follows through in the galactic network. He needed someone with clean credentials, someone who could access the banking systems without raising red flags. That's the whole reason Laxar invited you for tonight's dealings. You're not crew, you're a tool." Trinik felt his carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. "They'll eventually accept me," he said, hating how defensive he sounded. "I just have to prove myself and—" "Prove yourself?" Ilara cut him off again, and this time there was something almost angry in her voice. She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell the engine grease that covered her, close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her eyes beneath all the grime. She reached out with one grease-covered finger and rubbed it across his cheek, leaving a dark smear on his purple skin. "I had to prove myself," she said, her voice low and intense. "I had to make myself needed in the crew, had to become so valuable that they couldn't afford to get rid of me. I learned every system on this ship, made myself indispensable, and I did it because I didn't have any other option." She leaned in even closer, her eyes boring into his. "But you? Why are you here, Trinik? Why is the heir to the clan, the grandson of the leader himself, standing in this shithole warehouse, about to risk his life on a weapons deal with criminals?" Trinik felt all his prepared answers, all his careful justifications, crumble in the face of that simple, direct question. He averted his gaze, staring at the ground, at the walls, at anything but her face. He struggled inside, trying to find any reply that would sound convincing, that would explain his choices in a way that made sense. But there was no good answer. There was only truth, raw and simple and terrifying. So he gave up trying to explain and simply closed the distance between them, pressing his lips to hers. He felt the grease on her lips, tasted the bitterness of engine oil, and ignored it all. For a moment there was nothing but the two of them, nothing but this stolen kiss in a dirty warehouse. Then laughter, loud, raucous, and mocking. caught both of their attention. Trinik and Ilara jerked apart, stumbling back from each other as their heads whipped toward the warehouse entrance. Laxar stood there, framed in the doorway with 5 other crew members flanking him. They were walking slowly into the space, their movements loose and uncoordinated in the way people who had been drinking for hours. "I can't believe we had to leave," one of them was saying, his words slightly slurred. "The night was just getting good." "Yeah, that bartender was definitely interested," another added. "Could have stayed till dawn." "Should have told the mechanic girl to handle it herself," a third suggested. "She's the one who knows how to fly this heap." Laxar raised one hand, a gesture that immediately silenced the complaints. The crew members fell quiet as their leader's gaze swept across the warehouse, taking in the scene before him. His eyes lingered on Ilara, then shifted to Trinik, and a smile spread across his face. But instead of addressing Trinik, as the younger man had expected, Laxar turned his attention back to Ilara. "What happened to you?" he asked. "Did you fall into a grease tank? Take a bath in the engine coolant?" The crew members behind him erupted in laughter. Ilara simply crossed her arms over her chest, seemingly unbothered by their mockery. "Someone had to make sure the ship works tonight," she said, her voice level and calm. "And I was pretty sure none of you had enough brain cells to do that." The laughter cut off abruptly. Laxar's smile faded slightly, his eyes narrowing. But then he shrugged, apparently deciding that Ilara wasn't worth his energy, and turned his attention to Trinik instead. He crossed the warehouse floor with long, confident strides. When he reached Trinik, he raised one hand and brought it down hard on the young man's back. Trinik stumbled forward a step. "Ah, you came," Laxar exclaimed, his smile returning at full force. "The crew thought you'd bounce, thought you'd get cold feet at the last minute. But I always believed you'd come through. I knew you had the guts. You said yourself you'd be a no-show." One of the crew members grumbled from behind Laxar. "Lost me 50 credits on that bet." "Shut up," Laxar said without turning around, his eyes still locked on Trinik's face. Then, quieter, with what might have been genuine curiosity. "Are you ready for tonight?" For the first time since agreeing to this job, Trinik felt the full weight of what he was about to do crash down on him. He was really putting himself into danger. He was walking into human Marine clan territory to trade weapons. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. One more stupid young male who died because of someone who was not worth it. Then he stole a glance at Ilara, still covered in grease, still standing apart from the crew even though she was essential to their operation. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the loneliness that she kept buried beneath layers of competence and sarcasm. "I'm ready," he said, and was surprised to find that he spoke almost without reluctance. Laxar's smile widened into something predatory. "That's what I like to hear." 2 hours later, the whole crew was aboard the ship, strapped into their seats as Ilara controlled it from the captain's chair. Some grease was still visible on the white streaks of her purple skin, dark smudges that she hadn't fully managed to clean away. Her hands moved across the controls, her eyes locked on the displays in front of her. Trinik sat in one of the passenger seats, strapped in tight, his hands gripping the armrest. He was more than a bit worried about the fact that they were flying low, terrifyingly low. Sometimes he heard the scraping sound of the ship's hull touching the canopies of the trees below them, metal grinding against wood in a way that made his teeth hurt. It was especially concerning given that they didn't have a single external light on. They were flying completely dark, navigating by instruments alone through a forest at speeds that would make a collision instantly fatal. A particularly loud metal noise rang through the hull, and Trinik couldn't contain his worry any longer. "Why do we have to travel so low?" he asked, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. Laxar and the rest of the crew burst out laughing. "The radars," Laxar explained between chuckles. "The Galactic Federation installed monitoring stations all over this continent. They can track all air traffic, log every flight path, identify every ship." He shook his head with disgust. "Things have only gotten worse with all their efforts to enforce order on what they call the distant anarchist planets. Like we're supposed to be grateful for their influence." They always send some death worlders to keep order," another crew member chimed in. "Used to be the Varsak. Remember them? Those big reptilian bastards with the armor plating and the bad attitudes. Now it's those humans." Laxar laughed again, the sound carrying an edge of bravado that Trinik didn't entirely trust. But we're still here, aren't we? And that's not going to change no matter who they send to try to control us. Federation, Marines, doesn't matter. We'll always find a way. Trinik was not so sure about that as they continued their flight. The crew talked loudly, joking and laughing as if they were on a pleasure cruise rather than heading to an illegal weapons deal. Ilara remained focused on not hitting any trees, her concentration absolute as she threaded the ship through the forest canopy. Trinik struggled to keep his worry inside, his hands still gripping the armrest tight enough that his knuckles were probably white beneath his purple skin. They advanced under the moonlight, the twin moons of this world providing just enough illumination to turn the forest below into a landscape of silver and shadow. Time seemed to stretch and compress strangely. Then, finally, a large clearing came into view. It was nestled close to a mountain range, the dark shapes of peaks rising against the star-filled sky. And there, somewhere in the clearing, was a single, lonely, blinking red light. Laxar leaned forward in his seat, his eyes locked on that distant beacon. A smile spread across his face. "There they are," he said, satisfaction dripping from his voice. "The Merlab people from the other continent. Right on time." He turned to Ilara. "Land somewhere nearby and keep the ship ready to fly," he ordered. "If anything goes wrong, I want us in the air within 30 seconds. Ilara nodded without taking her eyes off the controls. The ship began to descend. Laxar turned to the rest of the crew. "Move the crates as soon as we land," he said. "Load them onto the robotic carriers. I want to be able to hand over the goods the moment payment is confirmed." Then he stopped and walked toward Trinik. His hand came down on the younger man's back again. Another one of those too hard slaps that seemed to be Laxar's preferred method of camaraderie. "Now's the time to see what you're made of," Laxar said, his voice low enough that only Trinik could hear. "You're going to get a gun, and we're going to walk over there together to negotiate. You'll make sure we get our money before we deliver the guns. Think you can handle that?" Trinik swallowed hard and nodded. "I can handle that," he said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. The ship touched down, the landing gear compressing under the weight. Before the engines had even fully powered down, the crew was up and moving. They opened the cargo bay and began loading crates onto robotic carriers. Squat, six-legged machines that could traverse rough terrain while carrying several hundred pounds of cargo. Laxar grabbed two weapons from a concealed storage compartment. He tossed one to Trinik, who caught it awkwardly, the shape of the gun unfamiliar in his hands. It was a standard energy pistol, the kind that could punch a hole through most body armor at close range. "Come on," Laxar said, checking his own weapon. "Let's go make some money." And then they were walking deep into the clearing, Laxar and Trinik in the lead while the rest of the crew followed behind, pushing the robotic carriers loaded with crates of weapons. The moonlight painted everything in shades of silver and shadow. The grass beneath their feet was tall enough to brush against their knees. In the distance, the single red light continued to blink, a beacon drawing them forward. As they appeared, Trinik began to make out shapes on the other side of the clearing. Figures were moving, organizing themselves, preparing for the meeting. The Merlab people. Trinik's first impression of them was striking. The Merlab had gray skin, soft-looking and almost fragile in appearance, with no hair anywhere on their bodies that he could see. Their frames were thin, almost delicate, giving them an appearance of weakness that might have been reassuring if not for the equipment they wore. Each Merlab was encased in an exoskeleton, sophisticated mechanical frameworks that augmented their strength and provided protection. The exoskeletons were military equipment, probably Federation surplus sold on the black market, and they transformed the frail-looking Merlab into imposing figures. Combined with heavy weapons they carried, weapons that would have been too large for them to lift without the exoskeleton's assistance, they looked far from helpless. The two groups approached each other cautiously. Trinik could feel the tension ratcheting up every step, could see the way both sides kept their hands near their weapons without actually drawing them. They stopped about 10 feet apart, the two groups facing each other across an expanse of moonlit grass. Trinik could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. One of the Merlabs stepped forward, and Trinik assumed this was their leader. When he spoke, his voice was processed through a translator, giving it an artificial quality. "You are Laxar. the Merlab leader said. It wasn't a question. I am, Laxar confirmed. And you're the one I've been speaking with through the encrypted channels? I am. The Merlab's head tilted, a gesture that was hard to decipher. You brought the merchandise. All of it, Laxar said, gesturing to the crates on the robotic carriers. Federation surplus, energy rifles, plasma pistols, grenades, some heavier ordnance. Everything we discussed. And you brought someone to verify the payment, the Merlab leader said, his mechanical voice somehow managing to convey skepticism. This is Trinik, Laxar said. He'll confirm the credits are real and that the transfer is legitimate before we hand anything over. The Merlab leader stared at Trinik for a long moment, and Trinik had the uncomfortable feeling of being evaluated, measured, judged. Then the Merlab reached into a compartment on his exoskeleton and pulled out something small enough to hold in one hand. He tossed it through the air. Laxar caught it smoothly, a glowing blue crystal, about the size of a thumbnail, pulsing in Laxar's hand. That's both the access key and proof of transfer in the galactic network, the Merlab leader explained. 12 million credits, as agreed. Have your man verify it. Laxar turned and held the crystal out to Trinik. Do your thing, he said. Trinik took the crystal with hands that he hoped weren't shaking too badly. He pulled out his datapad, a thin device that folded out into a larger screen. His fingers moved across the interface, opening the Galactic Network banking application, preparing to verify the transfer. I need a few minutes, Trinik said, his voice sounding small in the open clearing. But as he began the verification process, he realized that he wasn't going to get a few minutes of privacy to work. Every eye from both groups remained focused on him, watching in tense silence as he navigated through the banking protocols. This was perhaps the most tense moment of Trinik's life. His hands moved across the datapad screen, entering commands, accessing secure systems, checking and double-checking the transfer details. The crystal interfaced with his device, feeding data through encrypted channels. Lines of code and financial information scrolled past his eyes. The silence stretched. Someone coughed. A piece of equipment beeped. Trinik ignored it all, his entire world narrowing down to the glowing screen in his hands. Then, finally, the verification completed. Trinik felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost dizzying. 12 million credits here, Trinik announced, his voice clear. But even as he spoke, he felt a lingering unease. He didn't know the details of what had been negotiated. Was 12 million the correct amount? Had Laxar agreed to more? Was this only a partial payment? For a moment that felt like an eternity, no one spoke. No one moved. Then Laxar laughed, breaking the spell. Everything's in order, he announced, his voice full of satisfaction. He turned to the Merlab leader. You're free to check the weapons. Take your time. Make sure everything's as advertised. Suddenly, the tension evaporated. The Merlab moved forward, their exoskeletons whirring as they approached the crates. Laxar's crew stepped back, giving them room to work. Someone made a joke. Trinik didn't hear what it was, and someone else laughed in response. Trinik felt himself relax for the first time since they'd landed. It was going to be okay. They were going to pull this off. They would complete the deal, collect their payment, and get out of the Marine Clan territory before anyone knew they'd been here. He should have known better. The noise came first, a distinctive sound that every spacefarer recognized instantly. The high-pitched whine of propulsion systems, multiple units firing simultaneously. Trinik's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the sky above the clearing. And there they were. A group of humans flying on individual propulsion backpacks descended from the darkness above, dropping toward the clearing in unison. They wore heavy combat armor that gleamed in the moonlight, and the lights mounted on their equipment blazed bright, cutting through the darkness. They weren't trying to be stealthy. They didn't need to be. Trinik's blood ran cold. The Marines. Some of the Merlabs started to raise their weapons, their exoskeletons whirring as they brought heavy rifles to bear on the descending figures. Laxar's crew tensed, hands moving toward guns. Then a voice boomed across the clearing, amplified through some kind of speaker system until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. You have been caught in the act of conducting an illegal weapons transaction in violation of the Galactic Federation standard. The voice announced in perfect, unaccented galactic standard. Resistance is futile. Lower your weapons immediately to avoid a massacre. The humans had formed up above the clearing, their propulsion backpacks keeping them hovering about 20 feet off the ground. Trinik could count at least a dozen of them, maybe more. It was hard to tell with the bright lights they carried, making it difficult to see exactly how many armored figures were up there. Neither side immediately opened fire. The Merlab hesitated, their weapons raised but not firing. Laxar's crew stood frozen, clearly trying to decide whether fighting was worth it. The humans maintained their position, waiting, their weapons trained on the group below but not yet firing. Trinik felt panic rising in his chest, threatening to choke him. His first real job with the crew, and it had gone south exactly as his grandfather had warned him it would. He was standing in the middle of a clearing in Marine Clan territory, surrounded by illegal weapons and with federal law enforcement literally hovering above him. The humans began to descend further, landing on the ground around the perimeter of the clearing. They moved with perfect coordination, forming a circle that surrounded both groups of criminals. Their weapons never wavered from their targets. "This is your final warning," the amplified voice said. "Lower your weapons and prepare to be taken into custody. Compliance will be taken into consideration during sentencing." Trinik's hand moved toward the energy pistol Laxar had given him. He was ready to drop it, to surrender, to accept whatever punishment was coming. At least he would be alive. Then Laxar spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You know what?" Laxar said, and there was a strange note in his voice, something between desperation and bravado. He turned to look at the Merlab leader. "I think there's more of us than there are humans." Trinik's blood ran cold. "That's suicide," he breathed, his voice barely audible. "Shut up," Laxar snapped at him without taking his eyes off the Merlab leader. "What do you think?" he asked again in a low voice. "We got what, 25 of us total? Against a dozen Marines? I've heard stories about these humans, but they're just stories. They bleed like anyone else." The Merlab leader was silent for a long time. Trinik could see the calculations happening behind those large, dark eyes, weighing the odds, considering the options. Then one of the Merlab raised his weapon and opened fire. Hell broke loose. Energy bolts and plasma fire lit up the clearing like lightning. The humans scattered, their propulsion backpacks carrying them into invasive maneuvers. Return fire came immediately, sharp, precise bursts that found their targets accurately. Trinik stood frozen, his weapon still holstered, watching in horror as the battle unfolded around him. He saw a human take a laser blast directly in the chest, the beam of coherent light painting a bright line through the darkness. The Marine staggered back half a step, then kept moving as if nothing had happened. The blast had left nothing but a large burn mark on the heavy armor. Another human took a plasma shot to the shoulder. The superheated matter splashed across the armor, and Trinik was certain he would see the figure fall. But the Marine just shrugged it off, already bringing his own weapon to bear on the shooter. The opposite, however, was not true. The Merlab leader suddenly jerked backward, his exoskeleton sparking as bullets tore through it. Trinik just watched as the gray-skinned figure gained about 20 new holes in his body in just 10 seconds of confrontation, the kinetic rounds punching through both the mechanical framework and the soft flesh beneath. The Merlab leader collapsed to the ground, his exoskeleton seizing up as its operator died. Trinik realized with absolute clarity what kind of situation he had put himself in. His grandfather had tried to warn him. Everyone had tried to warn him. The humans of the Marine clan had a reputation across half the galaxy, and that reputation had been earned in blood. He ran for cover, diving behind a large rock formation at the edge of the clearing. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't fire a single shot. He just ran, his survival instinct overriding everything else. From behind his cover, Trinik could see the battle continuing to unfold. The Marines moved quickly, their weapons fired in controlled bursts, each shot finding its target. The Merlab were falling, their exoskeletons sparking and felling as the kinetic rounds tore through them. Laxar's crew wasn't faring much better. He saw one of them take a burst into the chest and go down instantly. The rest of the crew, perhaps realizing they were going to lose, had begun to retreat. The Merlab, who were still alive, scattered in different directions, using their exoskeletons' enhanced speed to try to escape. Some of them ran for the forest. Others pulled back toward their side of the clearing. Laxar himself was running toward Trinik's position, toward the rock that provided cover. But he was in the open, exposed, and the Marines were not in a forgiving mood. Trinik saw it happen in what felt like slow motion. Laxar was maybe 5 steps away from safety when the burst of fire caught him in the arm. The impact spun him around and he fell to the ground hard, his weapon flying from his grip. For a heartbeat, Trinik stayed frozen behind his rock. This was Laxar, the man who had gotten him into this mess, who had led him into danger. He could just stay here, let Laxar take his chances. But despite the utter fear coursing through his veins, despite every logical reason to stay safe behind cover, Trinik found himself moving. He forced himself to act, launching himself out from behind the rock and running into the middle of the fire toward where Laxar had fallen. The chaos around him intensified. The Merlab had brought 2 small ships into the fight, sleek, atmospheric craft that swooped down from the sky, their weapons blazing. The Marines changed formation immediately, some of them breaking off to engage the new threat. The concentrated fire that had been directed at the ground forces suddenly had to split its attention. Trinik took advantage of the moment of chaos. He reached Laxar and grabbed him under the arms, hauling him backward toward the rock. Laxar was heavy, and his injured arm made him awkward to move, but his equivalent of adrenaline gave Trinik strength he didn't know he had. He dragged Laxar those final 5 steps and pulled him behind the rock, out of the direct line of fire. The moment they were behind cover, Trinik tried to check Laxar's wound. His hands moved toward the injured arm, but before he could even touch it, he found himself staring down the barrel of a gun. Laxar had pulled out an energy pistol with his good hand and was pointing it directly at Trinik's head. His face was twisted with pain and rage. "You didn't shoot," Laxar snarled. "You just ran. Left us to fight while you hid like a coward." Trinik felt fear, regret, and guilt wash over him in equal measure. His voice came out shaky when he spoke. "It wouldn't have changed anything. Didn't you see? Not a single human was fatally injured. We never had a chance." Laxar said nothing, his finger tightening on the trigger. Trinik could see his own death in the other man's eyes. "Where's the money?" Laxar demanded. "Give me the credit crystal, now." Trinik froze, his hand instinctively moving toward his pocket where he had stored the blue crystal after verifying the transaction. At that moment, one of the Merlab ships took a catastrophic hit. It spiraled out of control, trailing smoke and fire before crashing into the far side of the clearing. The explosion lit up the night like a second sun, and the shockwaves sent debris flying in all directions. Laxar's eyes flickered to one side just for a moment, distracted by the explosion. Trinik didn't think. He simply reacted. Slapping the gun to the side with one hand as the other hand pushed off the ground, he launched himself away from Laxar, running in a desperate sprint toward the tree line at the edge of the clearing. Laser fire followed him, but it wasn't coming from the Merlab or the humans. It was Laxar himself shooting at Trinik, the one who had just risked his life to save him, the one who had dragged him to safety. Energy bolts seared past Trinik's head, close enough that he could feel the heat of them. One shot scorched the grass inches from his feet. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, his legs pumping, his lungs burning. He couldn't believe he was still alive when he finally found cover behind a tree. The chaos was still continuing in the clearing behind him. He could hear the weapons fire. He could see the flashes of light through the trees. The Marines were still fighting the remaining Merlab ship, their individual propulsion units allowing them to engage in an aerial battle with the spacecraft. They showed no fear, no hesitation, fearlessly facing a small ship with nothing but the flying vehicles on their backs and the guns they carried. Trinik made up his mind. He bolted deeper into the forest, running away from the clearing, away from Laxar, away from the Marines and the Merlab and the entire disastrous weapons deal. His grandfather's words repeated in his mind like a mantra. One more stupid young male who died because of someone who was not worth it. But he hadn't died. Not yet. He was alive, running through the forest in the moonlight, his heart pounding and his breath coming in gasps. The problem was that he was on the wrong side of the clearing from where Ilara and the ship were hidden. She had most likely already departed when the chaos began. She wasn't stupid. She would have taken off the moment the Marines showed up, getting away while she still could. Trinik couldn't blame her for that. It was the smart thing to do. Which meant he was alone, on foot, in hostile territory, with no way to get off this continent. He felt hopeless and afraid as he ran, dodging between trees, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and the clearing. The sounds of the battle were fading behind him, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't slow down. Then he heard it, a sound that made his heart leap with desperate hope. The distinctive whine of propulsion systems, but different from the Marines' individual units. This was a ship's engine somewhere close by. A moment later, the canopy above him was suddenly parted by a blast of air from the ship's thrusters. Weak light from the interior of a spacecraft appeared through the trees, and a rope fell down beside him, dropping from somewhere above. Trinik didn't hesitate. He didn't think about whether this might be a trap. He didn't consider whether he was being paranoid. He just grabbed the rope and started climbing, his hands burning as they gripped the rough fiber. As he climbed, he felt the rope being pulled from above, someone hauling him up to help his ascent. The climb passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. His arms felt like they were on fire, his fingers were cramping. But he kept climbing, hand over hand, foot over foot, until finally he reached the open ramp of the ship. He struggled with the ramp for a moment, his exhausted muscles barely responding before he managed to take the last step inside. He collapsed on the metal floor, gasping for breath, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. When he finally looked up, he saw something that made his chest tighten. Ilara was already making her way back to the captain's seat, not even stopping to speak to him. She was focused entirely on flying them away from this place, her hands moving across the controls as she put distance between them and the clearing. Long minutes passed in the tense silence. The only sounds were the engines working and Trinik's labored breathing as he slowly recovered. Ilara kept her attention on the flight path, navigating through the darkness without speaking. Finally, Trinik couldn't take the silence anymore. He pulled himself to his feet and moved to stand behind the captain's seat. "How'd you find me?" he asked, his voice rough. Ilara's hands didn't stop moving across the controls. "I moved the ship when the humans showed up," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "But I kept observing the forest with the ship's thermal cameras to check if anyone would escape." I paused. "I was checking to see if you would escape." "I'm sorry, it's just me," Trinik said, and he meant it. He knew some of the crew had probably died in that clearing. Ilara shrugged, her eyes still on the displays. "I wouldn't have stayed at all if you weren't there. You should be glad." Trinik felt something warm bloom in his chest despite everything that had happened. "What now?" he asked. "I'll have to sail the ship," Ilara said, and there was a weariness in her voice that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Find another crew to work with. Start over somewhere else." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was harder. "But either way, I hope this was enough to prove to you that the clan heir and the troubled child of the village could not stay together." Trinik found himself laughing, a sound that surprised him as much as it probably surprised her. He moved closer, wrapping his arms around her from behind the captain's seat, feeling her stiffen slightly at the contact. "My grandfather told me two things," Trinik said softly, speaking directly into her ear. "He told me this job would kill me, and he told me you weren't worth it." He felt a change in Ilara's posture, a tension that hadn't been there before, but she said nothing. She continued flying the ship through the darkness. "The old clan leader was right about those humans," Trinik continued. "The Marine clan is every bit as dangerous as the stories say. But he was wrong about you." He pulled back slightly so he could see her face and profile. "You came back for me. You stayed, knowing it was dangerous, just to see if I would make it out." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the blue crystal, still glowing with its internal light. He held it up where Ilara could see it, and he watched her eyes go wide as she recognized what it was. "What do you say?" Trinik asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you say about starting over somewhere else? Both of us, together?" Ilara said nothing. For a moment, Trinik thought she might refuse, might tell him to return to his clan and forget her. Then she reached up with one hand and took his hand in hers, pulling it down to rest against her chest. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid but steady, beneath his palm. The ship's course began to change. It was subtle at first, just a slight adjustment in their trajectory. But Trinik felt it, felt the moment when Ilara altered their heading, pointing them toward a future that neither of them had planned, but both of them were choosing. They flew on through the night, the stars wheeling overhead, the ship carrying them away from danger and towards something that might have been hope.